In 2000, most home internet users relied on dial-up modems that were only about 1/60th the speed of a cable modem connection today. Moving the satellite images, which were stored as large files, from the centralized server to a user's PC posed a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Keyhole's founding goal was to find ways to give the user the sensation of being able to fly anywhere on Earth without periodically encountering a frozen image on the computer screen while new data needed for display was downloaded. By January 2001, Keyhole had put into place the necessary pieces for realizing its grand vision. It designed software that displayed one image while simultaneously fetching adjacent images that could be displayed next, allowing the user to move smoothly in any direction. The company struck a deal to have its software distributed by Excite at Home, a new company funded by Kleiner Perkins that was going to provide fast broadband connections to everyone. And it secured $4.6 million in first-round financing from Sony Broadband Entertainment. With the funds, it expanded its staff to 25 and readied its product for the mass market, spending to be in a position to hit the milestones it needed to reach in order to receive the second round of financing. By the spring of 2001, however, the dot-com boom had gone bust, and the Valley became a very inhospitable place for fledgling companies. Keyhole's CEO, John Hanke, would later describe the time as our generational equivalent of the stock market crash of the 1920s. Excite at Home went out of business, and Sony shut down its venture capital arm. Keyhole lost both the mass distribution and the follow-on financing it had been counting on. No replacements were to be had. The plan to offer Keyhole's service to the consumer market had to be shelved. Desperate for revenue, Keyhole rented some booth space at a trade show for commercial real estate brokers in June 2001 in Dallas. Visitors to the booth were able to fly wherever they wanted, from Dallas to Los Angeles, to Phoenix, to Miami, click, 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 and were probably the first civilians outside of the Pentagon and Keyhole's offices to experience seamless virtual flying with real satellite images. Jim Young, the executive in charge of the show, was immediately smitten and told the attendees that Keyhole's software would transform the industry. Sales to the commercial real estate business saved Keyhole from extinction. With brokers willing to pay $1,000 a year for a subscription and invest in a brawny $3,000 PC that could handle the graphics processing, Keyhole was able to eke out an existence and continue looking for ways to find a bigger market. The news business offered one promising opportunity. CNN was keen to use Keyhole's software, called Earth Viewer, for zooming down to wherever the moment's news stories were breaking. On the verge of CNN's signing a high 9-digit deal with Keyhole, however, budget cuts were ordered. CNN revoked the offer and instead offered Keyhole a take-it-or-leave-it arrangement in which CNN would receive permission to use Keyhole software, and in exchange, CNN would pay a token fee and display earthviewer.com in a corner of the screen. Hanke was not inclined to agree. He was staring at a $300,000 revenue shortfall and an upcoming payroll that could not be met. But in the end, he accepted. In March 2003, in the opening shock and awe of the Iraq War, CNN's Earth Viewer simulation of bombing missions over Baghdad, including dramatic swoops down to street level, brought Keyhole's software to the attention of millions of CNN viewers. Keyhole had a tiny customer base at the time, and when the exposure on CNN brought many curious visitors to its website, the servers could not handle the load and the site went down. The promotional plug on CNN brought not only the curious, but also paying customers, enabling the company to drop the price of a Keyhole Pro subscription to $400 annually. Keyhole benefited from the hard times prevailing in Silicon Valley in two respects. It didn't have to worry about competing startups, the bane of any new company in the Valley. After the crash, new companies that would have crowded into Keyhole's niche could not obtain financing. Keyhole also did not have to worry that it would lose its top engineers to other companies in the Valley, dangling tempting packages of stock options. Few companies could go public between 2001 and 2003. So its engineers were not tempted to quit their jobs and chase after seemingly better opportunities that would come with an imminent IPO. By 2004, however, venture capital firms had cleaned up their portfolios and were starting to look at deals again. Keyhole had made it through the bleak years by relying primarily on sales to real estate professionals, government agencies, and engineering firms. The time had arrived for it to dust off its original plans to try to sell its service to consumers, providing anyone with the ability to circumnavigate a virtual globe. Hankey visited venture capital firms, found interest, and quickly received an offer for a sizable investment. It was just then, in May 2004, in the midst of finalizing the details of the deal, that Keyhole was invited by Google, its neighbor just 6 blocks away, to pay a friendly visit and make a presentation. Keyhole did not see why Google was interested, and its first question was, what do satellite images have to do with web search? The answer was, think big. Think of geography as more than road maps and driving directions like MapQuest. Think of geography as a window upon all information. Think of the Earth itself as an organizing device for all categories of information, and satellite images as the way to pull users into a geographic framework. Think of how a user interested in, say, the history of Iraq could virtually fly down into Baghdad, where street-level images would lead to historical documents. The way the Googlers saw the possibilities, satellite images could have everything to do with web search, and any other kind of information search as well. Google hadn't gone public yet, and little was known on the outside about whether the company was doing well or was improvidently spending a dwindling pile of cash on its gourmet cafeterias and other frivolities, reminiscent of Valley spending at its most reckless, circa 1999. Hankey and his colleagues had heard rumors about Google, but friends who were working there were secretive. He later recalled, "It was like peeking over the fence of your rich neighbor's house. What's really going on over there?" Now the Keyhole team found themselves on the other side of the fence, in a Google conference room. They faced 6 Googlers, a mix of business development people and long-haired male engineers, and were surprised that the Googlers knew all about Keyhole and its software. Was this good, an indication that Google might be interested in acquiring the company? Or did it mean that Google was planning to offer a similar service of its own, which for Keyhole would be catastrophic? The Keyhole team could not read the faces of the Google representatives. The next day, Google called to say it was interested in acquiring the company. Keyhole had previously tried to sell its technology to web portals like Yahoo that were already using MapQuest and seemed most likely to be receptive to Keyhole's proposal to offer satellite imagery as complementary to road maps. Google did not disclose that it had formed a small group, what would eventually be called Google Maps, to develop its own maps and direction services that would be similar to MapQuest. But in Google's grand conception, Maps would serve a larger purpose as one of several related components, along with satellite images and geographic information, to organize the world's information. On its own, Keyhole had never even conceived of anything so ambitious. Nor had any of the other companies Keyhole had approached spoken of geography as a universal information tool in such a radically unorthodox way. Hankey recalled, "This was not just a breath of fresh air, it was a blast. We thought, they are either delusional or they're visionary." Another consideration in weighing Google's offer was the likelihood that Google would be able to popularize Keyhole's service much faster than Keyhole itself could. This alone was a powerful inducement to strike a deal. In Silicon Valley, most engineers work on projects that will never be completed. This holds true at large companies as well as small. If engineers are lucky enough to witness the rare day when the product is completed and launched, they will, in the overwhelming majority of cases, witness the product's failure in the marketplace. Hankey said, "Engineers live in fear of pouring their heart and soul into a project for 2 years, and then having it basically go on a hard drive and never see the light of day, certainly never see satisfied users, and never hear anyone say, 'Hey, that's an amazing program that you've written.'" Having Google express an interest in their work brought everyone at Keyhole closer to realization of the dream that not just thousands of people, but possibly Maybe, if the possibility could be imagined without jinxing it, millions of people would use it someday. The Google offer was a mix of cash and stock. Whether the stock would really be worth much at any point was an open question. But when Google disclosed to Keyhole its current income statement, worries on that score were removed. What the public could not yet see was that Google's web search advertising was making a nice profit. Keyhole agreed to be acquired, and over a weekend, the company moved into an empty Google building. Also installed on the floor was the Google team that was working on Google Maps, whose core had come from another recent acquisition, Where2 LLC. No formal organization chart brought the Google Maps and Keyhole teams together. The plan was simple: put engineers with similar interests in the vicinity of one another and let them figure out who would like to work with whom. This reflected the preference of the senior triumvirate to use a light touch in creating formal hierarchies at the lower levels, and permit teams to organize themselves as much as possible. Google Maps was well along in development when Google's acquisition of Keyhole was completed in October 2004. When Maps was released in February 2005, the Keyhole technology was not yet integrated with Google's. The principal innovation that Google Maps offered in its very first incarnation was providing users the ability to use a mouse to drag the map in any direction, which brought into view adjacent areas without needing to redraw the entire page, creating an illusion that the computer had maps of the entire world at the ready. It accomplished this by downloading only the data needed to extend the map that was being displayed. It showed streets and driving directions, but did not yet offer an option to display a satellite image as an underlying layer beneath the street grid. Keyhole would provide the satellite imagery for Google Maps. But Maps was designed to display a single square of roads and was not designed for high-speed travel. Although one could move in any direction, it was not much faster than walking by foot. It did not permit one to fly around the globe the way Keyhole's own software permitted. Technical limitations of web browsers like Internet Explorer or Firefox made it impossible to provide smooth navigation of high-resolution images. Google wanted to offer users the same breathtaking three-dimensional flight that Keyhole had offered. Keyhole promised in 2004 that you can fly through 12-plus terabytes of Earth imagery and data, spinning, rotating, tilting, and zooming. Think magic carpet ride. But users had to first install the specialized Earth Viewer software that Keyhole had developed, which Google renamed Google Earth. This irksome extra step presented a marketing challenge to Google. Its users, who were accustomed to using its other services without being asked to install additional software, had to be persuaded to go to the trouble of downloading the Google Earth software to their computers before they could take a test flight. To encourage users to give it a try, Google decided to make Google Earth available for free, without a subscription fee, at least for home and personal use. Nor did it rush to collect the payoff immediately by placing advertising for local businesses on the images. Advertisements would begin to show up only 6 months after its release. Google, no less than the Keyhole team, was giddy about bringing to a mass audience this new way of accessing information. As work proceeded prior to the launch, business considerations were not uppermost in their minds. The Keyhole database that Google acquired was not all that Google hoped for. As a startup, Keyhole had limited resources and had decided to focus on buying the images most likely to be of interest to its customers, who happened to be in the United States. Its coverage of the rest of the globe's surface was skimpy. This would not do for Google, which took considerable pride in the global reach of its business. Bryn, who was born in Moscow and emigrated to the United States with his family at the age of 6, was the one who most insistently pushed the Keyhole team to think outside U.S. borders. How could Google release a product called Google Earth that had only scanty coverage of most of the world? The staff set to work acquiring a globe-spanning collection of satellite images. As the preparations for the release of Google Earth were underway, Google Maps did its part to draw more users to Google. That was accomplished by clever individuals outside of Google, who wrote code so that data from outside of Google could automatically be superimposed upon a Google map. creating new uses for maps and giving users new ways to think geographically. Google made this possible when it permitted its users to pull map data from Google's servers to create their own hybrid mixes of maps and data, which were handled by their own web servers. The new creations were called mashups. The first Google Maps mashup was devised by Paul Rademacher, a software developer at DreamWorks Animation. He perceived that housing ads on Craigslist could be linked to a Google map and wrote code that showed each listing as a pushpin in the appropriate place on a map. The website he set up, Housing Maps, immediately drew thousands of grateful Craigslist apartment hunters. Google noticed and added features that made developing mashups easier. Its first step, Google hired Rademacher. When Google Maps were enhanced by mashups, they were capable of showing much more than streets. Mashups mapped fast food restaurants in San Francisco and other cities, lowest gas prices in New York State and other places, crime reports for Chicago and other cities, and news stories in the day's New York Times or other news outlets. These and thousands of other mashup sites served as an introductory version of a geographic interface to other information that had not been originally organized by geographic references. When Google Earth was released in June 2005, its database of satellite images had been filled out and made truly global. Anyone who took the trouble to install the software could zoom to any destination on the globe. But the one place that most users wanted to see first was their own home. Brin had anticipated that this would be the case when he had given each of his colleagues a quick visit to their homes, one by one, when he had provided them with a demonstration of Keyhole software the year before. Not everyone was impressed by Google Earth. Barry Diller, CEO of IAC Interactive Corp., whose holdings included Google competitor Ask Jeeves, scoffed, "After you've seen your house and all those other buildings that look like toothpicks from that height, what do you do?" To begin with, one could indulge in armchair tourism and go anywhere. Reaching Timbuktu, Mali took a traveler in North America about 3 seconds, the same time it took for the computer to zoom up, zip over, and then zoom down to any other spot. Eric Schmidt recounted in public talks how he had fulfilled a lifelong ambition to visit Everest from the comfort of his office. Websites like Virtual Globetrotting, Google Earth Hacks, and Google Sightseeing popped up, displaying the most interesting satellite images that users had stumbled upon. The tagline for the latter site was, "Why bother seeing the world for real?" Virtual tourism was highly diverting, but it didn't fully answer Diller's challenge. Enthusiasts showed the way, building their own layers of information, annotations, photographs, and mashups on top of Google Earth. Google would eventually even give users some latitude to correct the locations of houses and businesses and add new places. User contributions gave the service a distinctly non-commercial feel. Yet when users wanted to find goods or services in a particular place, Google Earth was ready to supply local business listings, which gave its users a second reason to rely upon it. Users could see exactly where they needed to go to find whatever it was they sought, and could do so staying within the familiar mini-world of Google Earth. Google sought to minimize irritating its users with requests to fill out many boxes on a screen when they wanted to see local businesses placed on a satellite image. Thanks to its work on algorithms in other parts of Google's business, Google Earth software was able to pull apart a phrase like cheap hotels NYC and distinguish which part referred to a place and which part described what was sought, and then place upon an aerial view of New York an overlay of inexpensive hotels. Finding local businesses this way was as easy as using the Yellow Pages, but initially the public simply shrugged. Not everyone wanted to take the time to download the Google Earth software onto his or her computer. If one wished to use Google Earth simply to find nearby businesses, one did not get a chance to experience the sensation of flying, and Google Maps served perfectly well for finding a local plumber or nail salon. Yet Google Earth, with its capacity to incorporate the creative additions of enthusiastic volunteers who were excited about the technical capabilities of the software, grew and grew. Before long, hundreds of thousands of different answers to Diller's questions spontaneously bubbled up. Humanitarian uses of Google Earth made front-page headlines. When Hurricane Katrina struck, the service helped the Coast Guard rescue victims by comparing images before and after the flooding, revealing the places where housing had been inundated. Its images elsewhere dramatized the effects of clear-cut logging in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, and it provided the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum the means to visually bring home the ravages of genocide in Darfur. Google Earth gave users the feeling that physical distance did not matter, that everyone on Earth was one's neighbor, close at hand. It vanquished the very distinction between the familiar and the unknown. All places could be known, or at least felt as if they could be known, when they too could be visited and brought rapidly into focus as the user experienced the sensation of flying halfway around the globe, descending from a high altitude until reaching a hovering point near the ground. All accomplished in a couple of seconds. In 2007, John Henke said in an interview, "The ability of people to connect from the very local to the Earth as a whole and then back to their own very local place is a really powerful way to make these connections that might otherwise be remote and abstract. We are inclined to think of events as happening out there somewhere else. And I think there's something in the experience of flying with this continuous motion from a place that you know and the familiar details of your town or city or community to this remote area where you can also see recognizable human details. You make that connection. Historically, with National Geographic, you have this beautiful map, and then you have this beautiful picture or this disturbing picture, and it's up to you to make this connection between yourself and a shape on the map. That's a pretty hard thing to do, and is very different from starting out and just continuously flying in, and then the details resolve as you're coming down in this continuous zoom. It's not just the dot on a map." American astronaut Bill Anders' photos of the Earth, taken in 1968 during the Apollo 8 mission, had vividly shown Earth's inhabitants how small a place the planet seemed when framed against the void. Now, Google Earth made the planet seem even smaller, a place where we are all virtual neighbors, separated by only a few mouse clicks. Robert M. Samborski, executive director of the Geospatial Information and Technology Association, a trade organization, said in 2006, only a year after the release of Google Maps and Google Earth, that Google's done more to raise the awareness of using maps than the industry's been able to do in the past 25 years. Google Earth also drew attention for its utility in less serious pursuits. Oddities turned up among its images. The Badlands Guardian, for example, a natural geologic formation near Alberta, Canada, was often visited by online aviators. It resembles a human head wearing Native American headdress and also appears to be naturally adorned with iPod-like earbuds that hang down, on a scale that makes the figures on Mount Rushmore look like miniatures. One could also pay an overhead visit to the Arizona farmer who carved a giant portrait of Oprah Winfrey across 10 acres of cropland, or to the 40-year-old barracks complex at a U.S. Navy base near San Diego that, from an aerial view, resembled a swastika. Sky in Google Earth, introduced in 2007, allows viewers to look upward and travel to individual stars, 100 million, and distant galaxies, 200 million. Attention could also be redirected back down to Earth to a more familiar group of stars found in Hollywood and its vicinity. Fans with no official connection to Google added home listings for Tom Cruise, Halle Berry, George Clooney, Angelina Jolie, and other film notables. Software that could be used for such breathtakingly disparate purposes, high and low, with the power to send a traveler either to the farthest edge of the known universe or to hover above Jim Carrey's estate, makes anywhere and everywhere appear accessible. The natural corollary, which was not fully appreciated at first, was that soon every non-famous person in the universe will be accessible to everyone else. Shortly after John Henke joined Google, he began to hear the first rumblings of the general public's uneasiness about satellite images breaching the privacy of individuals. Hankey attempted to allay concerns by explaining that the satellite images that Google used were generally 6 to 12 months old. Users could not swoop down and spy on a neighbor's backyard in real time, nor was the resolution of the photographs sufficient to permit a Google user to pick out any meaningful details. He added reassuringly, "It's not like you are going to be able to read a license plate on a car or see what an individual was doing when a particular image was taken." Strictly speaking, Hankey was correct. The resolution of the commercially available satellite imagery at that time was insufficient to portray clearly objects that were smaller than 2 feet. The resolution was improving rapidly, however. Aerial images, that is, those taken at very high resolution by airplanes at much lower altitudes than satellites, would increasingly be Google's source of images for densely populated places. Only a year later, in 2006, the first sighting of semi-nude sunbathers visible in images snapped by an aerial camera excited much commentary on blogs around the world. The human figures are just barely discernible atop a house in the Netherlands. They drew attention not because they are distinct enough to be prurient, but because the image graphically conveyed just how far aerial imaging technology had advanced. Surely the woman who was basking in the sun topless, face down on the deck of her own house, did not realize that she was publicly visible, from far, far above. Aerial photography would not seem to be all that intrusive, not when compared to what soon arrived: cameras mounted at street level. Just as Hankey was trying to reassure the public, a Google competitor launched by Amazon, called A9, dispatched camera crews to drive along the streets of 10 major cities and snap photos of the storefronts of every business, with the ambition of eventually including every business in the country. Soon after, Microsoft announced, in December 2005, the availability in beta form of what it called bird's-eye imagery for cities covering about 25% of the U.S. population. The Birdie, which was a low-flying aircraft, took pictures at a 45-degree angle, which made the landscape much easier to recognize and provided far more useful information than images taken from directly above cityscape objects. These initiatives were logical extensions of the same project that Keyhole had begun, and that Google was putting its own considerable weight behind, combining the specificity of a photograph with the abstraction of a map. Satellite images were the easiest way to get started and cover large swatches of the Earth quickly, but the project had a logic of its own. The closer to the ground and the more detailed the images, the more useful they would be to users. A year after Google Earth's introduction, Google was well along in upgrading its medium-resolution images, which represented 15 meters per pixel, with high-resolution ones at 70 centimeters per pixel that covered about one-third of the global population and provided sufficient detail to pick out cars and houses. Images with still finer resolution, of 10 centimeters per pixel, would follow. So, too, would a fully featured flight simulator, tucked into a new software release without announcement. Google seemed almost embarrassed by the technical riches that it was able to incorporate into Google Earth. The problem was that there was no natural way of determining that 15 meters per pixel resolution was socially acceptable, but 10 centimeters per pixel resolution was overly invasive. Nor was there any law or code that decreed shots taken from above were acceptable, but street-level views were not. If you were in the mapping business, you would seek out as many images, in as high a resolution as you could, from whatever vantage point provided the most visual information. Neither Google nor its rivals had any choice. In the information business, an imperative is at work, pressing for more, more, more. Right from the start, with its insistence on indexing all websites, not just a good selection, Google had appreciated the need for completeness. In its book search program, it showed a willingness to take on the most daunting of logistical challenges. With such new services as Google Earth and Google Maps, Google tried to offer products that were more comprehensive than its competitors, but its rivals were in close pursuit. In the heat of this competition, no company was willing to pause and ask whether it had gone too far, breaching individuals' reasonable expectations of personal privacy. Google's introduction of Street View to Google's Maps in May 2007 was inevitable, not only because of Google's own history and increased competition, but also because the combination of street-level photographs with street maps was so natural a pairing. In fact, this combination was so natural that it had been discovered a full century before, in the early days of automobiles. In 1907, Rand McNally published Photo Auto Maps, which used photographs of streets and landmarks with an overlay of helpful arrows to show drivers a recommended route. Inevitable as Google's Maps Street View was, if considered in the long view of events, its introduction was not universally well received. Initially, only streets in San Francisco, New York, Las Vegas, Miami, and Denver were available for viewing, but this was sufficient to produce many complaints about breached privacy. Mary Kaylin Casey, who wrote to the popular tech blog Boing Boing, received wide attention as an early victim. Her complaint was that her cat was plainly visible in the Street View image that included the exterior of her living room window. Kaylin Casey wrote, "I'm all for mapping, but this feature literally gives me the shakes." Wired magazine's blog invited readers to submit the most interesting urban street sightings found among Google Maps Street View images. Among the entries that readers voted as favorites were several photographs of young women in bathing suits lying on the grass, Stanford co-eds enjoying the sun, a woman in a car whose door was open as she prepared to step out, and though her face could not be seen, a portion of her underwear could. I think I see a thong. And a man apparently climbing up the front of a locked security gate. Break-in in progress. Just as with the reaction to book search, Google was taken aback by the negative publicity Street View generated. After all, its cameras saw nothing more than what anyone who was driving down the same streets at the same time would have seen. The company had taken one precaution. It had anticipated the need to protect the identities of anyone in the vicinity of domestic violence shelters and had removed images of the shelters. Other than that, Google had proceeded on the reasonable assumption that it need not treat public space as if it were private. What neither Google nor its critics realized was that our anonymity while walking about in public space in the pre-digital age was protected not by law, but by the crude state of technology. We felt invisible only because cameras were not in place to capture our images. Similarly, what had once been a paper trail of our unwanted encounters with the legal system remained invisible, practically speaking, because it sat in folders in the courthouse, requiring that a curious citizen expend energy and time in order to examine it. Placing those records online, where they could be easily accessed by anyone from any PC connected to the Internet, accomplished what Street View images also did. Things that were always a part of public space were rendered easy to see for the first time. As always, Google was preoccupied with its quest to improve the technology for gathering information and serving it up to viewers in useful ways. Its engineers had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They had built software that melded street maps and photographic images, and devised ways to improve existing technology. In the case of 4 of the first 5 cities covered by Street View, Google had relied on images collected by another company, Immersive Media, which had invented a geo-immersive video camera that resembled a ball with 11 lenses distributed around its surface. When mounted upon the roof of a car or van, it recorded a spherical video, continuously tagged with GPS data, that when played back could provide a 360-degree view from any spot. Not wholly satisfied with Immersive Media's images, however, Google had also tried out its own equipment for San Francisco's streets, which produced similar 360-degree views with the added improvement of extremely high resolution. The difference in quality was striking. When Lance Ulanoff, an editor of PC Magazine, attempted to sharpen with the help of Photoshop the somewhat blurry face of a woman that Google Street View had captured on the streets of New York, he found that the resolution was simply too poor. But in San Francisco's Street View images, he could easily read license plates, and also see in sharp detail the man who had become infamous on the Internet because he happened to be standing in front of a strip club when the Google camera car happened by. Legally speaking, Google was absolutely correct to argue, as Peter Fleischer, the company's global privacy counsel, did, that in the U.S. there's a long and noble tradition of public spaces where people don't have the same expectations of privacy as they do in their homes. This tradition helps protect journalists, for example. Practically speaking, however, Google had to back down in the face of heated criticism. About 10 days after the product was launched, the company began to remove images when an individual discovered his or her face in the Street View image and asked Google to remove it. Tellingly, Google accommodated these requests without publicly announcing that it was doing so. Schmidt, Page, and Brin still hoped to preserve the general principle that individuals did not enjoy a right to privacy when standing in public space. A few months later, however, Google retreated further, acknowledging that it would remove any image that contained a person's face or license number, regardless of who submitted the request. Having conceded the point that the faces that incidentally appear in the images have no bearing on the usefulness of its street views, it was just a matter of time before Google attempted to automate the process of removing facial detail. In May 2008, the company began to test software that automatically blurred faces on its New York images. Google did not rush to introduce Street View for Google Maps outside the United States. Without precedents established elsewhere by other companies for Street Views, Google anticipated an international outcry about invasions of privacy. Satellite photos had already led to much grief for Google. When Google Earth was introduced, the governments of South Korea, Thailand, and Russia complained about images in which military facilities and government buildings were clearly in view. A Russian security analyst acidly said, "Terrorists don't need to reconnoiter their target. Now an American company is working for them." Google retorted that whether it displayed the images or not, it could not stop their circulation online because they originated from other sources. But this line of argument did not appease the governments that were upset. When the Rand Corporation looked in 2004 at the availability of geospatial information, including satellite images, that would help terrorists and other hostile forces mount attacks in the U.S., it concluded that less than 1% of geospatial information that was made publicly available on federal websites and databases was not readily available elsewhere. Federal, state, and local government officials, apparently unaware of the fact that satellite images that Google Earth used were supplied to Google by other companies and widely distributed, did not hesitate in ordering Google to remove from Google Earth whatever images they deemed compromising to national security. Vice President Dick Cheney's residence at the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, the U.S. Capitol, and the U.S. Military Academy at West Point were declared off-limits. The zeal of some officials extended also to protecting prying eyes from seeing overhead views of an amusement park in Rye, New York, a sewage treatment plant in Yonkers, and the site of dearest importance to our national security, the headquarters of PepsiCo in Purchase. The futility of these measures was revealed in many instances when the images that were removed from Google were discovered on other sites. For example, a nuclear power plant in Ohio that was blacked out on Google Maps was available in clear detail on Microsoft's maps. Massachusetts officials who tried to obscure the locations of state facilities in images they supplied to Google were left looking foolish when Microsoft and Yahoo obtained undoctored images of the same state facilities from commercial sources. Nonetheless, it was Google that was depicted as acting irresponsibly. One cartoon showed a barber offering a customer not just a mirror, but also a PDA to use to examine the just-completed haircut. Would you like to see the top on Google Earth? This was harmless fun, but more serious criticisms were leveled. In June 2007, in the wake of arrests related to a plot to blow up fuel tanks at Kennedy International Airport, Thomas P. DiNapoli, New York's state comptroller, held a press conference and criticized online mapping services, naming Google Earth in particular for providing too much information that might compromise counterterrorism efforts. The suspects had used Google Earth to obtain an aerial view of the airport, but how this provided too much information was not clear. The New York Times accompanied its news story of the plot with an aerial photograph showing in crystalline detail the same fuel tanks at JFK. Still, the temptation to demonize Google was irresistible. Assemblyman Michael N. Gianaris chimed in light of the use of Google Earth in the JFK plot, we must ensure these programs are not used as blueprints for an attack on our country. Hearing such alarms, Americans naturally would feel a tug of worry about national security vulnerabilities. In such circumstances, we all too readily forget the bedrock democratic principle that American librarians have always understood and protected. Access to information must never be subject to government control. Classified military secrets are the only permissible exception. Censoring images shown by Google Earth is no more effective than censoring book acquisitions at the local public library. The information originates elsewhere and will circulate no matter what symbolic action may be taken at one particular place to block its distribution. The abundance of information that is now available online was brought home to Google's own Eric Schmidt in 2005, a few months after Google Maps was released. When Eleanor Mills, a reporter for CNET News, decided to explore a story about Google and threats to personal privacy, she devised an interesting exercise. She gave herself 30 minutes to see what personal information could be discovered about Eric Schmidt using Google. Schmidt's net worth, his political fundraising activities, and his hobbies were readily found. Mills wrote, "That such detailed personal information is so readily available on public websites makes most people uncomfortable." Schmidt lashed out wildly, not at the public websites on which his personal information resided, but at the messenger that delivered the news. CNET was informed that Google was unhappy with the use of Schmidt's private information in its story, and as punishment, Google, as a matter of company policy, would not respond to any questions or requests submitted by CNET reporters for 1 year. Ridicule was heaped upon Schmidt from various quarters. The Register derided his hissy fit. Hadn't Schmidt promised publicly to build a Google that knows more about you? A New York Times headline sardonically read, "Google anything, so long as it's not Google." Schmidt, of all people, should have understood that CNET, like Google, cannot control what information is placed on the websites of other organizations. His bizarre reaction overshadowed Mills's original story, which had been quite discreet, in fact, in not putting in the story Schmidt's home address, which she also found online. If she had wanted to, she could have used Google Maps to give her readers handy directions to Schmidt's home doorstep. In speeding the democratization of technology and information, Google had made the world a smaller, more intimate place. But in a small world, its wealthiest residents feel more vulnerable to unseen threats. This had not been anticipated by Schmidt or anyone in the Google conference room when Brin had used keyhole software to fly to the houses of the others. After 2 months passed and Schmidt had regained his composure, Google quietly restored a normal working relationship with CNET. Schmidt never released a public mea culpa, but by dropping the sanctions against the news organization, he belatedly showed his understanding that he had undermined Google's most basic message, which is that users will find online, with Google's assistance, whatever information they need. The company has helped to bring a high-resolution view of the entire globe within reach of our itchy fingertips. But if anyone believes the drawbacks outweigh the benefits, blame cannot be assigned to any one company. The world is experienced as smaller because computer technology now makes it possible for it to seem so. And that technology does not come with an undo button. Google Maps Street View created unease not just because images of identifiable people were being collected, but because it was Google that was doing the collecting, the company that seemed to be collecting more and more information about everything. Had another company, say MapQuest, introduced Street View, a company that wasn't attempting to organize the world's information and didn't possess information other than road maps, directions, and traffic conditions, it seems unlikely that Street View would have excited the same reaction. Before long, we are likely to look back upon Street View or the first-generation mashup as crude experiments. We will come to rely upon mashups that combine not two but many disparate sources of information: restaurants, menus, professional reviews, customer reviews, health department inspection reports, the presence of friends in the vicinity, one-click reservations, overlaid onto a single map, updated continuously. And we will become accustomed to having access to all of this information, seamlessly integrated together anywhere we happen to be. On any internet-connected device, on any screen, tiny as well as large. The Google vision is of a multidimensional mashing together of all information, integrated in novel ways, yet instantly accessible from a centralized computing cloud. The geospatial dimension is one addition, and the personal dimension is another, including the very personal. Beginning with its users' email, Google has taken steps to incorporate into its storehouses the digital documents that users regard as the most sensitive ones they possess. One by one, it has added new categories of information that it offers to store on its servers: word processing documents, spreadsheets, calendars, and other personal and office documents. Central storage provides convenience, to be sure, but it also creates a tension between greater convenience and diminished privacy, or at least worries about diminished privacy. When a single company is determined to organize the world's information, including one's very own personal information, will the service be welcomed more than feared? Just as Google discovered when it introduced Google Maps and Google Earth, making our world seem smaller also serves to make us feel more vulnerable to unwanted attention from others. Putting our most personal information on the same servers that hold publicly accessible information triggers anxieties that Google's reassurances about privacy protections can never completely quell. The anxieties are less about measurable risks than about inchoate concerns. We are only too happy to avail ourselves of greatly improved access to information about others, but then, oblivious to our inconsistency, we object to others having greater access to information about ourselves. The more control we gain of information, thanks to Google, the more we also experience a nagging worry about loss of control of information most dear to us. Chapter 7. A Personal Matter. Google began in the information business, but the hardware and software it developed to handle the world's information turned out to be able to do more, much more. Without planning to do so, Google has embarked on its most audacious initiative to date, offering to replace the basic software that runs on individual computers with software services that run on its own machines. Customers will send the data or documents to the cloud, and Google will take care of everything else. Software as a service, as it is called, promises to perform just as ably on a centralized server as the software that we place on our own machines, eventually. Software as a service offers other tantalizing collateral benefits: much lower costs, elimination of upgrade hassles and virus infection headaches, and the ability to leave laptop computers at home and rely instead on much simpler devices for portable computing, like internet-connected cell phones, which do not need much processing power because software performs the necessary work on the centralized server. A shift from local computing, using software that is installed on the PC, to cloud-based software as a service, using software that runs on a centralized server, represents a threat to two of Microsoft's core businesses: its Windows operating system franchise and its Office application suite. Software as a service renders the kind of operating system used on a customer's end irrelevant. It could be a Mac system, Linux, or something other than a PC entirely, such as new kinds of ultra-compact tablet computers that will be internet-connected, what chip manufacturer Qualcomm calls pocketable computing. Nor will customers have reason to purchase new copies of Office if they can create Office-like documents using software that runs on someone else's computer and is available for much less cost. In 2008, Google further encroached on Microsoft when it began providing Google Docs users the ability to work on documents even when they lack an internet connection, such as on a plane. Google engineer Philip Tucker described it as bringing the cloud with you. When the connection is restored, the work that was done offline is automatically sent back up to the cloud. Google's interest in expanding beyond a role of merely providing information to one of providing software services for a wide gamut of purposes has become visible not as a clearly announced vision, but in bits and pieces. Google has not declared itself to be a strategic competitor with Microsoft, and it seems to have taken pains to downplay the competitive threat that its software as a service poses to Microsoft's businesses. When Eric Schmidt was chief executive at Novell, he repeatedly warned that it would be foolish for any company that challenged Microsoft to moon the giant. Google was reluctant to develop a web-based email program partly because many Googlers believed that doing so would, in the words of one Google engineer, incite Microsoft to destroy Google. Google's software-as-a-service offerings have been introduced without the benefit of decent marketing, beginning with Google Apps for your domain and evolving into today's simpler Google Apps. Among the applications are an online word processor that it acquired in 2006, originally called Writely, and an online spreadsheet that Google developed internally. In October 2006, the company rechristened the two as Google Docs and Spreadsheets. Determined not to be copying its rival, Google stubbornly refuses to use the name that would be most natural, Google Office. One by one, Google has added online versions of Microsoft software that users were accustomed to using on their desktop. Google Calendar was released in beta mode in 2006. A PowerPoint-like presentations module for Google Apps arrived in 2007. As Google expands its portfolio of services, its servers host categories of personal information that extend well beyond the functions of Microsoft Office. Online purchase histories, Google Checkout, instant messaging, Google Talk, blogging, Blogger, social networking, Orkut, and recordings of phone conversations, Grand Central. Eric Schmidt predicted that only a few specialized applications, like high-end graphics processing, would stay on desktop computers, while 90% of the computing for which we use desktop PCs today would be handled in the cloud, on remote servers like Google's. The first step that Google took in the direction of building software as a service was to offer its own email service, Gmail. Adding email marked a significant departure from its original single-minded focus on web search. When Sergey Brin was interviewed by the Stanford student newspaper in April 2000, he said that Google was deliberately following a different path from Yahoo, which offered a complete set of information services that were intended to keep users from having any reason to go to another website. "All we do is search," he said proudly. The year before, Larry Page had said, "I won't say we won't add services, but we wouldn't put free email on our site unless we thought we could do a much better job." In those earliest years, Google was supplying search services on a wholesale basis to Yahoo, and it hoped to supply search to other portals, all of which had their own email services. By deliberately sticking to search only, he said, Google minimized the competition we have with people we might work with. Google's focus on search led it inexorably to email, however. Internet users spent far more time working with email every day than they did carrying out web searches. And email messages were as difficult to search as the web had been before the arrival of search engines. Important messages were mixed with unimportant, and when the accumulation of messages grew beyond a certain point, it was difficult to find a particular message easily. Sorting messages into folders was helpful, but required a maddening investment of time. Many users did not bother, with the result that many messages a user would have liked to save fell victim to mass purging when the inbox became full. It's not surprising that Google, the company with the all-encompassing mission of organizing the world's information, would feel compelled, sooner or later, to have a go at organizing email, too. Google's email project began in modest fashion. Paul Buchheit, Google employee number 23, who had coined "Don't Be Evil," was asked in 2002 if he would be interested in starting work on an email product. He had experience working on another email project before joining Google and was delighted to be asked. He was the much-vexed recipient of 500 messages a day and wanted to have a better way to search his messages. A colleague, Sanjeev Singh, joined him on a part-time basis, but it took a while before the rest of a small team was assembled. When Brian Rakalski, an engineer freshly graduated from Stanford, was told he would be assigned as associate product manager to Google's email project, he was taken aback. Email? What did email have to do with working on search algorithms? The answer was simple. Brin and Page had come to view email as an unsolved search problem. A move into email now seemed natural to them. But they did have to persuade other Googlers. Look, they said to skeptics, the information in email is at least as important as some random web page. The fact that you can't find an email that you want is ridiculous. Once the newly hired Rakalski adjusted to the idea that Google was planning to provide an email service, he plunged in happily. He had spent his share of fruitless hours attempting to retrieve particular messages that refused to appear, and he realized a user could find any message in a trice if Google's search engine could be applied to the problem. Most veteran Google engineers were more resistant to the idea. Their main concerns were that email would be a distraction, diluting the company's focus on its core strength, web search, and that it would be costly, requiring more hard drives to store messages and attachments. Who would be willing to pay for it? The email service that would become Gmail would indeed be costly. Rakalski was asked to prepare financial projections that showed scenarios of all kinds, but Gmail promised to be a money loser under even the sunniest assumptions. Page's and Brin's support of the project wasn't unconditional. The team had to pass periodic executive reviews. It would have to figure out how to make a profit from the service, and it would have to demonstrate that the payoff was large enough to risk alienating Google's two largest partners at the time, Yahoo and AOL, both of whom had enormously popular email services. The Gmail team got by with candor. We admit we don't know at this point how we're going to make money, but as we learned from our experience with web search, if we provide the public with something useful, we'll eventually figure out a way to make the service profitable. Buchheit and Marissa Mayer shared an office and often discussed business models. Later, Mayer recalled telling Buchheit, "Look, this is easy. We're going to give them small mailboxes for free and upsell them into larger mailboxes. That's what everybody does." Buchheit counterproposed placing advertisements on Gmail. Paul, Mayer replied. Ads are never going to work. Either we run banner ads, and they're not going to be targeted, and people will develop blind spots, and they'll fail in terms of effectiveness, and we're not going to get money and annoy our users. Or we're going to target the ads at their email, which is just going to be creepy and weird. People are going to think there's people here reading their emails and picking out the ads. It's going to be terrible. The two went back and forth, with Mayer returning again and again to her prediction that the ads would be either irrelevant or cause a lot of privacy concerns. The highest priority, she felt, was to fix the problems that afflicted their prototype so that it could perform the basic functions of sending and receiving messages. About 3 a.m., the time the two customarily brought their workdays to a close, Mayer prepared to go home, but Buchheit stayed behind. Her parting words to him were, "So, Paul, we agreed. We're not exploring the whole ad thing right now." He said he agreed. But in an empty building in the wee hours of the morning, no one was around who could deny his having a little fun with the email prototype, which was sufficiently functional that he, Mayer, and 4 other Google employees were relying upon it, including Brin and Page. Buchheit downloaded semantic analysis software from the Internet that could analyze any block of text, identifying the grammatical function of every word in every sentence, and then figure out the sentence's meaning and distill the meaning into a few keywords. He hooked it up to the ad database that Google used for web search results, which was designed to match a given keyword with particular advertisements. Then he connected the advertising code to the email program so that it automatically served up ads based on the content of each individual email message. By 7 a.m., he had the satisfaction of seeing a functioning ad system running, and he went home. When Mayer came into the office around 9 a.m. and logged into her email, she saw the ads and was irked. She weighed calling Buckheit immediately to have him restore the system before Bren and Page saw the ads, as she knew they sometimes have weird views about privacy and what's creepy and what's not. Bren, in particular, had been outspoken about his belief that attempting to target ads based on what users were reading, rather than what they were actively searching for, would never work effectively, and the ads would be perceived as an aggravating distraction. She decided to let Buckheit sleep for another hour before ordering him to return to the office and take the ad function out. But before long, she noticed that a few ads that accompanied her email seemed reasonably useful. In one message, in which a friend had invited her to go hiking, an ad for hiking boots appeared. In another, mention was made of Al Gore's upcoming visit to the company, and the ad server displayed ads for books related to Gore. She decided to let the experiment run a bit longer, and was glad she did. When Bren and Page rolled in and saw the ads, they were delighted. Seeing how well even a rudimentary prototype of an ad-matching service worked convinced Bren that he had been wrong to dismiss it. Buckheit's improvised use of semantic analysis demonstrated that algorithms could do a satisfactory job of selecting advertisements to accompany any given text that was displayed online. This late-night experiment became the basis of Google's second most important advertising program, AdSense. Google offers website owners the opportunity to run advertisements on their websites that are supplied by Google's network of advertisers. For participating websites, Google software crawls the site, performs semantic analysis on the text on each page, and then automatically selects ads that are displayed on the right-hand side of the page matched to the meaning of the text. It calls this contextual advertising. Site owners and Google split the proceeds when visitors click on the ads. When the Gmail team stumbled across the opportunity to use semantic analysis software to serve ads matched to any text, even text on other websites, Google moved quickly to introduce the service. AdSense was launched in March 2003, a year before Gmail was ready. Mayer had been concerned that users would perceive advertising that was closely matched to the contents of their email as creepy, and that was an issue that would surface as soon as the product was publicly released. But in the near term, the team became preoccupied with other, more technical issues in getting the service up and running. The hardware and software infrastructure that Google had built for web search was not well suited for hosting email. File systems that had been designed to be updated occasionally when Google's web crawler noticed a change at a website had to be redesigned so that they could be updated continuously. This necessitated significant changes in Google's back-end software systems. Google also had to learn to treat data that it was collecting with greater care. The inexpensive hardware it relied on was expected to fail, and the company expected that some of the information its crawlers had captured would occasionally be lost before the system had made backup copies. Those data losses were inconsequential as long as the service being offered was merely web search, because the lost information, before long, would be captured by the crawlers again. A lost email message, however, was not replaceable. Google's email system would receive only one copy, and it would land on a machine whose components could not be relied upon. Google had to redesign its system to be truly fail-safe. Google could have resorted to buying the special hardware used by the leading web email providers for solving this problem. Google's engineers did consider this option, but the company's grand vision for its email service made that impractical for economic reasons. At the time, Yahoo provided its email users with 4 megabytes of storage. Google, however, was preparing to offer 250 times more, 1 gigabyte, to each user for free, providing what was seen at the time as sufficient space to permanently store all email messages that an individual ever received. It would have been exorbitantly expensive for Google to use the hardware that others were using, which had the most reliable and most expensive components available. The only way Google could execute its plan would be to work with the same inexpensive hardware it used for web search and develop new software systems that would ensure emails would not be lost. By early spring 2004, work had progressed sufficiently that a date for launching the service could be penciled in. Brin weighed in with the suggestion that it be announced on April 1st. After all, April Fool's pranks were a treasured tradition at Google. What better joke could be arranged for the day, Brin said, than to introduce a real product in such a way that the public would not know whether it was to be taken seriously or laughed off as a prank. The press announcement of the preview release of Gmail mixed the serious and the comical. The headline said that Google had created search-based webmail, a transparent attempt to make the expansion of Google's web search business seem a natural one. It explained that search was the number 2 online activity and email was number 1, and appended a strange comment from Brin and Page. "Heck yeah," say Google founders. The inspiration for the project was attributed to a Google user who kvetched about wasting time trying to find messages and having to constantly delete email like crazy to stay under the 4 megabyte limit imposed by a Google competitor. With 1 gigabyte of storage, Google offered its users a way to be able to hold on to their mail forever. Predictably enough, the announcement was received with puzzlement. Was Google serious? The "heck yeah" suggested not. The promise that users would be able to hold on to email forever also seemed like a joke. Who could possibly afford to offer a free service that made promises that extended to forever? The fact that Gmail was not available initially to anyone but a tiny group of invitees meant that most of the curious could not sign up and see for themselves, which further stoked skepticism. While some news publishers, such as the Associated Press and Reuters, treated the announcement seriously, others treated it as a publicity stunt. At Slashdot, one person chortled that mainstream news organizations had fallen for a joke that would go down in history as one of the biggest pranks ever pulled. The confusion led the British news site The Inquirer to call the announcement Google's April 1st cock-up. The fuss was a boon in free advertising for Gmail, but the public's initial reaction was wary, just as it tended to be whenever Google announced an expansion of its information collections. Some initial Gmail users were spooked by the feeling that Google was reading private email in order to match ads. There was also some grumbling about Gmail's decision not to offer a delete button. By forcing users to work their way through cumbersome menus in order to delete a message, Gmail encouraged users to simply ignore and retain their unwanted email. The two problems of Google's reading email and retaining email seemed connected in a sinister way, as if Google was intentionally trying to probe as much of its users' private lives as it could for commercial purposes. Whether a delete button should be provided was a question that had been debated at length by the Gmail team. Buchheit was a dogged advocate of no delete button, and his arguments had prevailed. Users would be best served, he said, by a design that made retention of email the easiest course. He wanted to save users the burden of cognitive overhead as they pondered whether to save or delete messages. With Google Search available within the Gmail system, users would eventually realize, he believed, that it was best to just archive everything. To Gmail's first-generation users, however, email was highly personal, the most personal information that an individual processed on her or his computer in a day. They didn't want to be told how they should manage their messages, and they were demonstrative about their feelings. Jen Fitzpatrick, a senior engineer at Google, later said that every member of the Gmail team had stories to tell about their family, their friends, random strangers they would meet at parties when they would tell them they worked on Gmail. The common refrain was, "I want a delete button. Don't you get it? I want a delete button." In January 2006, almost 2 years after Gmail's introduction, a delete button was added. The other problem, the concern that Gmail's ads were encroaching on users' privacy, was not so easily solved. Googlers had convinced themselves that Gmail users would see advertisements as helpful. In their 2004 Playboy interview, the two Google founders were grilled about Gmail. Yes, Page admitted, the matching of ads to the content of messages seems a little spooky at first. But Brin emphasized that the only alternative would be intrusive, big glaring videos that would appear before a message appeared, so it's a pretty obvious choice. The Googlers were flummoxed when Gmail's first users were uncomfortable about Google's deciphering the meaning of their email messages. It did not seem fair that Google was criticized for this. After all, the other web email services also used software to scan the contents of messages, looking for viruses and spam. All email messages could be said to be scanned too whenever a user performed a search. Brin tried to call attention to the fact that scanning was automated, no one is looking, so I don't think it's a privacy issue. But the fact that Google introduced ads that were linked to the contents of the email messages seemed to make the difference. Yahoo Mail and Microsoft's Hotmail were getting a free pass on their automated scans simply because their systems ran banner ads, as most websites did, oblivious to the contents of the rest of the web page. The attack on Gmail that most frightened Google was mounted in the California Senate, where Liz Figueroa, a Democratic state senator, sponsored a bill placing limits on the information gleaned from scanning of email messages that could be shared with third parties. Figueroa said that her legislation guarantees that our most private communications will remain just that, private. The California State Senate passed the bill, but it died after being sent to the State Assembly. One could argue that Google should have anticipated the public's distrust of its plans for Gmail, with its centralized, permanent storage of personal data. Microsoft had tried years before to move users' personal data from scattered places into a centralized repository in the cloud. The spectacularly unsuccessful outcome of Microsoft's efforts should have provided cautionary lessons for all who followed. In 2001, 3 years before Gmail was introduced, Microsoft had launched its own centralized data storage service, My Services, which would include, in due time, an address book, personal calendar, word processing documents, and email. Its users would retain full control over who would have access to their information, which was supposed to make My Services user-centric. The first offering would be Passport, a service that would permit a user to use a single login name and a single password at all websites that signed up to participate and work with Passport's master repository of login information. Microsoft planned to show how convenient this service was by introducing Passport first to Hotmail. The company thought its plans for a new family of information services would be heaped with praise, but the project, all too aptly named Hailstorm, was instead assailed. The unfortunate name made for an inauspicious beginning. Mark Lukowski, the senior Microsoft engineer on the project, had been responsible for assigning a temporary name while the project was in development. He chose Hailstorm for fun, knowing that it would aggravate Microsoft's marketing group, which would come up with the final name. The Microsoft marketers dithered, however, and when the day of the introduction arrived, no replacement name had been agreed upon, so, by default, Hailstorm it was. The service drew nothing but derision. Microsoft was a company that had failed to secure the public's confidence that it could handle sensitive personal data. In the previous 12 months, Microsoft had issued 12 security-related software updates for its Internet Explorer, trying to address gaping vulnerabilities. It had also suffered the recent embarrassment of an intruder breaking into its own internal corporate network. In order to address the breach, the company was forced to block all external access for a while, even preventing 40,000 of its off-campus employees from using its own network. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to Passport's winning acceptance was the public's unease about a system that made all of one's personal data, including credit card information that Microsoft offered to manage as an electronic wallet, accessible with a single password. Having one's personal information scattered in various places seemed to many people to be a sensible form of protection from identity theft, a problem that had become impossible to ignore. Earlier that year, a Brooklyn restaurant worker had been charged with successful online theft of the identities of Oprah Winfrey, Steven Spielberg, and Martha Stewart. When Hailstorm was introduced, a coalition of privacy groups mobilized and formally complained to the Federal Trade Commission about Microsoft's ability to track, profile, and monitor users of its Passport service. Microsoft had no allies in this fight, and Hailstorm was dead on arrival. When Microsoft was unable to sign up a single company willing to work with it on the project, the company quietly dropped it. Google's executive leaders were determined to succeed precisely where Microsoft failed. The introduction of Gmail drew criticism, but nothing like the public outcry about Hailstorm, because Google had merely introduced email alone, not a comprehensive plan that would encompass the centralization of all personal documents. The criticism of Gmail soon faded. The bill in the California legislature was never passed, and Google was able to proceed. Google learned from its Gmail launch. Brian Rakowski enumerated the mistakes that Google had committed. The company had not pre-briefed journalists and had not conferred in advance with the leading privacy advocates, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Electronic Privacy Information Center. The proper sequence, he said, was to first get their opinions and figure out if you're doing something wrong. In looking back, Rakowski marveled at the public's focus on the scanning for matching ads while ignoring much more serious privacy issues, such as the increased risk that email on centralized servers could easily be subpoenaed, or personal information in email messages could be shared with advertisers. Nobody was talking about those privacy issues and the few things we were doing to protect users' privacy, he said. Rather than talking about the inherent downside to storing your email on a server that you don't control, users were worried about the matching of ads to content by a non-human device. How many times would Google have to field the same question from users? Is Google reading my email? And answer with, Google is not reading your email. Brad Templeton, the chairman of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a sometime consultant to Google, agreed that the matched advertisements were not a substantive problem and called the concern about Gmail silly and a bit paranoid. But he conceded that the widespread fear of computerized scanning of email, however irrational, could not be dismissed. It is not only important to have your privacy, it is important that you believe you have your privacy, he pointed out. The mere suspicion of being monitored changes your behavior, and you become less free as an individual. Templeton might not have found the advertising problematic, but he did have other concerns about Gmail and Google's privacy policies. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA, which treated email as a private means of communication, like a phone call, required that police obtain a wiretap warrant in order to read it. Once an email message was stored centrally, however, it would no longer be considered as private communication, but rather as data in a database, and would not be protected by the Act. Not only that, but Google's privacy policy allowed the company to look at, or even release to a law enforcement agency, a user's email in circumstances that would never be permitted were the company to gain access, theoretically, to its customers' postal mail. This was true not just of Google, but also of its competitors, like Yahoo and Microsoft, which were also combining web-hosted email with web search. Templeton was concerned about a troubling risk that email would become a target for government surveillance. He noted, when our papers are at home, mass surveillance of them simply doesn't scale. It's too expensive. Online, it scales well. This audiobook is continued on Disc 6.